First of all, thank you all for coming today. This is the American Security Project and Center for Climate Security joint event on climate change and the risks in national security. We think this is an important and timely topic, but we also know there's a lot of stuff going on in the Hill today. So thanks for taking the time to spend a little bit of time with us and hear about these important issues and what's going on. I want to first say thanks to you all for coming, and thanks to Josh Klein of Senator Cardin's office, who I don't see here today, but for getting us into this beautiful hearing room, and thanks to the Center for Climate Security, and I'll give it to Tom Watson to say a quick word or two on that. So.
Thanks, Andrew. Hi, I'm Tom Watson. I'm the Director of Government Affairs with the Center for Climate and Security, and I'd like to reiterate Andrew's opening remarks. Again, we appreciate you all coming today, and thanks to Andrew and Esther Babson and the staff from ASP for setting this up, and also to our distinguished panelists today. You're very fortunate to have a team of real experts in this area. They're very passionate about these subjects and are willing to come out and volunteer their time. And we hope today is very useful for you. I know you'll gain a lot of insight, but I think you'll get a sense of urgency and criticality of this subject to take back with you today. Thank you for taking the time to join us.
Thanks, Tom. And to introduce myself, I'm the Director of Studies for the American Security Project. I've been working for about 10 years now on impacts of climate change on national security. Since back here in the Senate, I worked for then Senator Chuck Hagel on his legislation to ask the intelligence community to do a national intelligence authorization on climate change and security. So I think it's an important issue. Our esteemed panel here thinks it's an important issue, and we'd be happy to discuss this further with you afterwards. So my job here today is mostly to get out of the way. So I'm going to do that. Let me just briefly introduce our panelists. I'd encourage you to pick up the bio packet from outside, because I can't do their long resumes justice. I would just encourage you to read it. And I'll introduce all three, and then I'll turn it over to Admiral McGinn to start. So first is Vice Admiral Denny McGinn, United States Navy, retired. He's going to be talking about what do we mean by climate security, and talk about his career, his recent career in the Pentagon, and what the DoD is doing on it today. Next to him is Brigadier General Stephen Cheney, U.S. Marine Corps, retired. He's my boss, CEO of the American Security Project. He's going to talk about global security threats and why we think this is important today. And then next to him is Brigadier General Dave McGinnis, U.S. Army National Guard, retired. As he likes to say, he spent 50 years in national security policy. So he's going to talk about more regional threats and National Guard's mission on climate and disasters and everything. So with that, I'd encourage the rest of you to read the rest of their bios. It's long and illustrious. But I'm going to turn it over to Admiral McGinn, and thank you, and thanks to all of you.
Thank you, Andrew. Having left service as Assistant Secretary of the Navy about 3 months ago, this is my first time back in a hearing room, and the scar tissue isn't throbbing too badly. It's reasonable. I'm really glad to see everybody here. This is a really, really important topic that gets kicked around so much in a political sphere, but doesn't have that focus that we really, really need on what is the business case for why we should be concerned about climate change and all of its manifestations around our nation and literally around the world, where U.S. leadership is so critical. I'll set a little context. My stipulation is that our economic security, our energy security, and our environmental security are all inextricably linked. You do something big in any one of those, and it's going to have an effect on the others. And they effectively form a bedrock for our overall national security in all of its facets. So we can't simply put on blinders or look through a soda straw field of view at climate change without having that broader context. And what that does in the political sphere, where things like climate change get kicked around and there's a lot of opinion but not so much analysis, is it provides more context and meaning for why people, why Americans, why global inhabitants, why our elected officials, our leaders, should be concerned about climate change and should be actually doing something about it. It is a risk. My colleagues on the panel here will talk more about that in terms of how does it constitute a risk in terms of the global geopolitical realm. Is it a recipe for more mission for our wonderful men and women in uniform around the world? It certainly is if you simply look at humanitarian assistance, disaster relief in the wake of natural disasters, where they are more frequent and more intense, and people are crowding more and more into the coastal areas, concentrated urbanization. You really have a recipe for some very, very challenging humanitarian assistance, disaster relief. You can extend that to an accelerator for tensions or a pressure cooker of tensions, economic, religious, political, all kinds of fault lines, where you have a recipe for fragile societies, fragile governments failing and creating a vacuum into which all manner of bad things will happen. Narco-terrorism, paramilitaries, terrorism, global terrorism, on the list goes. But when you have a threat, as we do, in the form of climate change, it is going to be a recipe for more mission for our United States military. Indeed, all of the facets of our power that we exercise, diplomatic, economic, and certainly military overseas. Here at home, for many centuries, over 2 centuries, when we started building up what today we call our military infrastructure, our system of bases and stations and ports, we have had relatively stable situation. Sure, there's the occasional Gulf hurricane or Atlantic coast hurricane or wildfire that threatens our West Coast bases. There are certainly severe weather events, breakouts, tornadoes, what have you, that or ice storms that can affect the middle part of our country. But these days, as we look ahead, we see a fundamental threat to parts of our infrastructure. I need look only to Hampton Roads and the unbelievable military infrastructure, not just Navy, but Marine Corps, Army, Air Force, Coast Guard, and see a threat to the utility systems, to the transportation systems, to the ability of those installations to act as launching pads for putting American national security power downrange. If you can't get the ships underway with their crew intact out of Hampton Roads, you're going to delay the application of military force or humanitarian assistance somewhere else where they are called upon to go. So the assumption that our military enterprise infrastructure is always going to be there, our places and bases, is now being called into question. The good news is that given a threat, our nation, our military, has the ability to do unbelievably innovative and creative things. And the things that we need to do can be encapsulated by a key word, and that is resilience. Resilience, the ability to, as the old Timex ad says, take a licking and keep on ticking, to be able to continue the mission and to minimize the time that that a disruption takes place and the depth of loss of functionality, that is resiliency. So we can do things, and we can do it in partnership with the private sector for finance, third-party financing. We can create jobs, we can create value chains that end up with a better national as well as military infrastructure that directly contributes to our economy and our economic security, certainly to our environmental security, and to the extent that we prevent bad things from happening like floods or wildfires, and it goes directly to how we can underpin in a better way our national security. So those are a couple of thoughts, and I'll turn now to Steve, and he'll give you a perspective that will be focused on the military mission.
Admiral McGinn, thank you, and thank you for your great work over the last couple of years. You really got that ball rolling over at the Pentagon. I just hope we can keep it rolling. I well remember back in June of 1999, I was a bright, bushy-tailed young brigadier general and was told I was going to take over Parris Island, and I was ecstatic. I mean, I love that recruit environment. I love working with young people. I go down to the base, check in with the old commanding general, and he says, you know, you're going to have a lot of problems, but I'll tell you what your number one problem is going to be. And I said, what's that? And he goes, hurricanes. Now, they hadn't had a hurricane hit that base for about 40 years. And so I kind of laughed at him, and he said, but we have a plan. Marines are good at planning. It's all in place in case something catastrophic happens. 60 days later, Hurricane Floyd, Category 5, dead aim at Parris Island. It was the height of our season. We had 10,000 recruits on deck. We're given about 48 hours to take them off because they predicted a storm surge of 26 feet, and the above mean sea level was 12 feet at the base. Do the math, we were going underwater. So we evacuated 10,000 to the Albany Logistics Base in Georgia. Very fortunately, it was a glancing blow and missed us, but it was a real wake-up call for me as the young guy in town sitting there going, boy, what am I in for this time around? And we were in for a big-time hurricane. And just coincidentally, this year, they had another Category 5 take aim. They evacuated again. They avoided it. But it's becoming a much more frequent occurrence to our bases and stations, not just in the United States, but worldwide. Diego Garcia is a good example in the Indian Ocean. About 4 meters or a little less above sea level, it will probably eventually go underwater, if not from normal high tide. So most of all our coastal bases and stations are threatened by rising sea levels, which, of course, are caused by climate change. The American Security Project has this topic on its agenda for well over 10 years, formed by then Senators Kerry, Hagel, Hart, and Rudman in 2005, 2006. And this was an issue that they brought up consistently. And the concept was, can we find some folks who were not partisan, not political, who would have some security credentials, who could talk the security implications of climate change? And so they put together a board that had about 8 retired admirals and generals, 2 from each service, 3 and 4-star, that indeed have talked that issue ever since. And I think we've kept that flame going, talking about climate change. We at the American Security Project over the last 3 years have been to about 30 cities in this country talking about it. And then we've had an overseas tour, been to Berlin, Brussels, London, among other cities, talking about climate change and national security implications. So what we've seen is the groundswell among mid-America and the common Americans who really do kind of get it. Certainly it's a not in my backyard thing. If you go to, for instance, Pittsburgh, which we did on our first city stop, the mayor of Pittsburgh got it. You know, they're a confluence of 3 rivers. They have some huge environmental and climate problems associated with flooding. They understand it. There are a lot of other cities that get it as well. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about the security perspective and the impacts on national security. I break it into 2 parts, strategic and tactical. Now, tactical, or the bases and stations, is what I say, and I've addressed that, the ones that are going underwater. On the strategic side, climate change, there's no doubt, is contributing to instability worldwide. And I'll give you 2 very poignant examples. Nobody would really associate Arab Spring with climate change. But you go back to 2009, 2010, the forest fires in Western Russia decimated the wheat crop. And we've got video of Putin actually embargoing the wheat so it couldn't be shipped out of the country because they had a shortage of wheat. So there was a shortage of wheat in the Middle East. which is a staple, of course, of bread, which is a staple of their diet, and it started the economic turmoil that happened for the Arab Spring. The prices went up, contributed to the instability there. I'm not going to say it's the sole factor, as we well know there were many other factors here, but it was a contributor. As well, from 2007 to 2011, the biggest drought in the history of Syria. And what that did was it drove everybody who was in the agricultural business into the cities. One city in particular, Aleppo, and I think everybody in here knows what Aleppo is. And that became a huge target for Assad. You know, he saw the people there, and plus that, you had a significant proportion of unemployed young men who couldn't provide for their families, and in rolls ISIS. A great target for them, and it was instability that was partially fueled by Arab Spring. So you can see that particular case, and my last poster child case is Bangladesh. 1.5 foot rise in sea level gives you to 20 to 30 million refugees. And don't take my word for it. You can take Major General Muni Razaman from Bangladesh, his word for it. They know it's going to happen. This is the battleship that's already going down the row, and that level of sea rise is going to happen. The problem you have here is those refugees cannot go to India. There's an armed border, much like the Berlin Wall. You try to cross it, you'll get shot. Probably not going to Burma or Myanmar either. So where are they going to go? And you're going to have an exodus. If you think there's a migration problem now, for instance, in the Mediterranean, in Europe, in the Middle East, this one will be 10 times worse. And they know it's going to happen. That's the sad part about it. And they're trying to plan for it, but it's really difficult. And that leads me to talk about Admiral Sam Locklear, the Pacific Command commander a couple of years back, who said his #1 threat was climate change. And he was heckled a little bit by that. But here is a combatant commander that had to do the response to Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines. 12,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines respond to that particular catastrophic event, 8,000 people killed. And I would be the first to say this is the only country that could mount that level of response. Nobody logistically could do what we did to help the Philippines. We did it pretty much out of the goodness of our heart. Certainly we did it to help an ally. But he foresaw that this was going to contribute to instability in the whole Pacific Command area in a number of areas. I mentioned Diego Garcia, I mentioned Bangladesh, the Philippines for sure. He knew that that's causing his problems, and his planners, as the Admiral said, that his planners, the military is pretty good at planning. Long term, will look at this as an accelerant to instability or a threat multiplier, and they recognize that climate change is causing some of this instability. And the real bottom line to this is, we know what's causing climate change when you get down to the bottom of it, and it's CO2 and pollution, and there are ways we can eliminate that too. And I didn't even get into, of course, all the issues that DOD is doing in terms of energy security and getting off of fossil fuels, and I can certainly address that in the Q&A. With that, let me turn it over to General Dave McGinnis.
Thanks, Steve. First of all, what the Admiral said in terms of economic, energy, and environmental issues, first element of national power, I learned over 50 years, I like to say, you know, he mentioned it already. This is my 51st year. I spent 29 years in uniform in various jobs. The last one, and my first civilian job, was as Director of Strategic Analysis in the Office of Secretary of Defense. And my last job in the Pentagon was Assistant Secretary of Defense. And all throughout that period, I have been a student of strategy and high strategy. First element of national power is your economy. That's what I've told senators, congressmen, and presidents. That's what you have to manage. And all of this has the ability to devastate our economy in the United States and economies of other countries. So other countries have the ability to lose power as well as we do in that sense. I'll cover it in a minute, but the second element of national power is knowing what the hell's going on in the world. It's your intelligence capability. And that fits right in here too. Back in the day when we were rebuilding the post-Cold War Army, and I was on the Army staff, General Gordon Sullivan tasked us all to go read the Toffler, all the books by Heidi and Alvin Toffler, and a lot of other futurist authors. They talked about the world we see today in Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan. They talked about cyber warfare. They talked about a lot of stuff. We still don't get it. We still don't get it. the longest war in history, and I sit around and I try to measure everything by how long it took Ike Eisenhower to plan the Normandy invasion. And we've blown that by a few years. So we got to get attentive to this thing in a way that we didn't get attentive to cyber and all the challenges we're wrestling with now that were forecasted back in the 1990s. And there are a lot of regional threats. In near-term threats, we've already talked about the Pacific and the comments by the Pacific Commander and the Indian Ocean, and they're real. Also equate to threats to our West Coast. We've seen one of the largest, and thank God for the Cleveland eliminating the California drought, but one of the roughest weather situations in a century over the last 3 or 4 months on the West Coast of the United States. And as we go farther out into Hawaii, the former governor of Hawaii was an individual who I'd known on the Hill and worked with on the Governor's Council when I was an OSD. He brought up the need to really get serious about this. And his comments got to my attention. I've known the guy for a long time. I trust him, and I looked at it, and he was right. And that's one of the things that really got me interested in this. Even though I've been dealing with natural disasters as a guardsman for years, all kinds of floods, ice storms, all of that stuff. But, and I looked at Hawaii and looked at the other archipelagos, and it wasn't too long before I really got scared. The near term, Steve already mentioned, the near term is the Indian littoral. Bangladesh is yesterday's problem that's going to hit tomorrow. It's already hitting. The order of magnitude should be on somebody's radar screen, especially the intelligence community, and I seriously doubt it is, but it's a real world thing. The second thing is we're going to lose our first United Nations member in about 25 to 30 years. The Seychelles are just going to disappear. They're just going to disappear. There's a lot of people who are probably frustrated because they can't bank there anymore and some other things, but the reality is that that UN member is just going to disappear. As will, as the Admiral mentioned, and I live in Williamsburg, Virginia now, so I'm very sensitive to Hampton Roads. We're going to lose a good portion of the Virginia coast, and we're going to lose about a third of Florida down the road if we keep going. But the real battle and the near battle for us is the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. And it's great to see that SINCPAC is working that, and I know they are. The National Guard has a tremendous advantage. They've been playing this game for a long time, a lot longer than anybody in the Pentagon has. And the Pentagon tends, in my history, tends to ebb and flow. The services tend to ebb and flow. The biggest problem I have with the way the Pentagon reacts, regardless of party, regardless of administration, is they give it a lot of lip service and very little money. And one of my favorite comments or questions when I talk to people about programs is, where's the palm line? If you don't have a palm line, you're just a figment. And that's part of the problem we have to look at in the defense budget, because I'm not satisfied that there's a big enough palm line for this project. But the Guard is working it, and they're still working it, and they always will, and the Guard has the organization to deal with this. Part of that organization has come about from the threat on terrorism and the coordination and the close manner they work with FEMA. So they have a regional organization that can respond to these type of situations and help provide the nation resilience and restoration capability. They exercise ability is limited because the funding is limited, not only to the National Guard, but also to NORTHCOM. Even though they talk a good game, the money's not there. They also have the depth, because many states not only have the federal reserves, but they also have some form of state reserve. And because they exercise a lot on other areas, like their nuclear power plants and other things that they do disaster exercises on, at the state level, they're very well attuned to dealing with and responding to create resiliency and reestablish conditions. The one thing when I started working in this is the need for a command and control system. We talked about resiliency, we talked about already, and we talked about that sort of thing. But we need a command and control, and we have the technology to do this. Believe me, we have the technology to do this already, from space all the way on down. We need a command and control system that can track events in real time. That's what we need, and we need to invest in it. Governors have been asking for it for a long time. They've asked DEH for it. The Governor's Council has asked DEH and the DOD for it, at least as early as 2009, because that's my earliest association with, at least with the Governor's Council, although I've been involved with the NJ for a long time, National Governors Association. And what we need to be able to do is take a tsunami or take a typhoon and start tracking it and start assessing it as it moves. And we have the technology to do that. That technology would also allow us to game those situations, game tidal changes, game weather changes, and bring the mega data together and apply it in an exercise scenario, and also apply it in a solution scenario when the real thing's happening. So if there's any one thing that I would argue for is that. The other thing, this brings opportunities, and there is a lot of work, and let me talk very briefly, and I'll shut up, about what the Guard has done in Europe, which is a model for the rest of the world. The Guard, for a long time, since the end of since the Cold War, has been organizing a program that was started by Colin Powell, called the State Partnership Program, where we have a state National Guard linked to a country, California and Ukraine. It's very important that California do their annual training in Ukraine right now. I'm sure you all can guess why. And Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, which are the first three countries. And you'll find a lot of Maryland, you'll find a lot of Pennsylvania, and guys over there all the time. At the 20th anniversary of that program, we had a meeting at the Marshall Center, and sponsored by SACUR and the Chief of the Guard Bureau, and I got a chance to represent the Secretary of Defense at the meeting. The meeting wasn't about military cooperation. The meeting was about aid to civil authority. And we brought in all of the Eastern European disaster response leadership. And the one thing I learned, if there's anything that brings people together quicker, and even though they've had animosities going back hundreds of years, is the Danube River and a few other rivers in Eastern Europe. 5, 6 states working those problems. And that's a model in terms of our ability to build resilience and to respond in this environment. And for the guys in DOD, Bangladesh is a partner of Oregon. And they both have similar problems if you're talking about the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. And I look forward to answering questions.
Well, thank you. Great comments, and I could take all the time I wanted to ask questions and get into this, but we've got a good audience here today. So what I'd like to do is just open it straight out to questions from the audience. So if you have a question, raise your hand. Please identify yourself. I'm not sure that we have a microphone going around, so yeah, no, I don't think we have a remote. So just. You right first, please identify yourself, and we'll speak loudly.
Yeah, I'll do that. Taylor Winkleman, I'm a science fellow at Senator Martis' office. Thank all of you for being here. I don't know, you promised to talk about fossil fuels, so can we talk about that?
Sure.
Fossil fuels been very, very good to us. They have. We would not be the country, the economy, the military, were it not for the hard work, the economic benefits, all of the blessings to our industrial base that have been provided by coal, by oil, by natural gas, and will continue for a number of decades. Problem is, we have come to understand that the downside of fossil fuels extends beyond local and regional air, land, and water problems. It's a global problem. And dumping a lot of greenhouse gases into the global commons of the upper atmosphere is the key problem, the key downside that fossil fuels have. So we should continue to love what fossil fuels have done and the people who work in that industry are continuing to do as we, as quickly as possible, start downsizing that. And one of the problems politically of people wanting to deny climate change or minimize it or just not believe the science is that they believe that it's all downside if you believe in climate change. I contend it's all upside, and that upside is to create new value chains, a new sustainable clean energy economy that can bring great prosperity, and oh, by the way, without that downside of local, regional, and global pollution and environmental challenges. And I think that that is what we have to view this at. America's good at it. We understand the problem, we get going, and it doesn't happen overnight. It can't, but it should happen as quickly as we can, and there is tremendous upside. If you look over the past 3 to 5 years, the number of jobs created by the entire fossil fuel industry, extraction industry, compare it to the jobs created in clean energy economy, including energy efficiency, it's like 10 times, 10x in this new creation of value chain. So a view on fossil fuels and how they fit into this context of climate change and our energy portfolio.
Yeah, I think that's right. Steve, do you want
The number one consumer of fossil fuels in this country is the Department of Defense. And I believe it was General Mattis who said in Iraq, if I can get off this tether of fossil fuels, because they were just as concerned about the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who were guarding the fuel convoys than they were about anything else, because they couldn't get off that tether of fossil fuels. So he certainly understood it at that time. I don't know now, but hopefully. But nonetheless, I think DOD and Admiral McGinn could probably address this better than I, has made great strides in trying to get off of fossil fuels, and not the least of which is the net zero program for all bases and stations. I've been to a dozen, I would say. You go to places like Nellis Air Force Base, which has one of the biggest solar arrays in the country. The intent there is to produce more power than you consume, and I think they've made great progress in getting there. And I can give you one last anecdotal story. When I was at Parris Island, sitting right next to my house was a rather large oil-fired power plant. Now, we drew our energy off the local grid, but when it either became too expensive or broke down, we would fire up this power plant. I mean, it was horrendous. Another case as a base commander, I sure didn't want to, one, depend on the grid, and I sure didn't want to be burning oil to create our power.
questions?
Let me jump in here real quick on fossil fuels. Again, I talked about technology for command and control. There's technology to deal with the fossil fuel problem. There's a lot of technology laying right on the shelves of our laboratories today. The issue is, how do we move that into the commercial market? How do we take an IP and commercialize it? There's technology, everything from microwave to disassociation, to help reduce the amount of carbons and other types of gases we're throwing out from fossil fuels. Conversely, it's not only fossil fuels. Animal husbandry is, I think, bigger by some estimates than fossil fuels. And I'm a great steak lover, so maybe there's some ways we got to figure out how to change it. I grew up on a farm. My first job was on a farm. I've been around cows for a long time. And one of the ways we need to deal with that issue is feeding cows. How do we feed cows, and how do we manage our animal husbandry? But there's a bunch of other areas that are generating. The point I want to make is there's a bunch of other areas that are generating these types of gases, not just carbon-based fuels. But I think there's a lot we can do, and that's the opportunities that I think the Admiral's talking about.
Yeah, thank you. Ma'am, right here.
I'd like to follow on the theme of what can we do to actually address the issue, and I'd like to request comments from you on what would you consider some of the things that the science community could bring to the table to assist in improving the planning process and also putting in place the technology that's
I was out at Los Alamos last year and saw your fusion experiment. That would help, but maybe something.
Well, if you divide the challenge up, its solution set, two areas. Mitigation, mitigate the amount of greenhouse gases we are producing. And you do that by shifting from fossil fuels to other forms of energy that don't create those greenhouse gases or other pollutants. So big science effort there, all the way from improved energy efficiency to things like fusion in the future. The other aspect of it is how do you adapt, or how do you deal with the effects? And that is the comments I made earlier. How do we make our communities, our bases, the local communities around them more resilient in the face of the kinds of threats that they will face? And it's not the same. What happens in Hampton Roads is concern about floods, sea level rise. What happens in the high desert could be a drought or extreme heat that prevents normal activities from taking place. So the ability to make our society, right down to the local community level and the individual level, more resilient, I think is a key role for science.
Andrew mentioned that we're big fusion proponents here at the American Security Project, and I know the rap on fusion's been for 30 years. It's been 30 years away. But they're doing research at both the labs, and now when you look at the work being done at MIT and Princeton in particular, dramatic strides in the science side of the house, particularly with magnets for the tokamaks, so that's one place. We went to the Argonne labs last year. I made the quip to one of the scientists that I really would like to buy a Tesla, but it's a bit out of my price range. And he said, well, you know, why would you buy a Tesla? And I like the concept. It's a clean car. It's electric. He says, that's 20, 30-year-old technology, batteries. He goes, what we've got here at Argonne is way far advanced. He goes, wait another 5, 10 years and you'll get a car that can go 1,000 miles on a battery. So just my point being, they're researching this at Argonne for sure. And then we were at Sandia Lab, 2 months ago, talking to them. And the nuclear research, by the way, on small modular reactors is proceeding very, very quickly. It's another alternative energy source, which is relatively clean. We all recognize the drawbacks, but it beats the hell out of burning fossil fuels.
The drawback you mentioned on nuclear, I have a friend right now who's doing some stuff at Oak Ridge with disassociation on waste. I think because I can say the same thing, at least I'm confident that in 20 years we ought to be able to deal with most of that nuclear waste the same way we're going to deal with the products of fossil fuels, and break it down and make it safe for the environment. And what we have to store will be much less, maybe 20%, 10% of what we got to deal with today.
Yeah. Let's go in the back, sir.
Gentlemen, Lieutenant Commander Admiral, I'm the defense fellow from Congressman Call. I just want to touch on two things that you guys kind of talked about. One, you talked a little bit about cyber and where cyber was, say, 20 years ago. We just see cybercom. Admiral Rogers just came out and said he's going to be the last NSA cybercom. It's finally going to become a COCOM. Do you see climate needing a climate com of some sort? And then also, you talked a little bit about FEMA, DHS, and right now we're having a problem figuring out where cybercom and DHS, how they work together. But is the climate DOD needing to get on board with DHS and really starting to work these issues today as opposed to 20 years down the road?
That's a good question.
My initial response is we do not and should not have a climate comm. Climate is everybody's business. It affects us all. It affects us in different ways and different time spans. So we want it right in the center of challenges and opportunities that every combatant commander or regional commander has to deal with, and not create a separate command where people can say, oh, that's their problem. They'll, go see them. They'll fix it. No, you have to fix it right where you live and work and operate.
I agree. Same issue with cybercom. Truth be known, 1994, I was working in OSD, and a man who was very dear to me, Andy Marshall, came down and said, we need to do something about this. And we couldn't get anybody in the building to listen to either Andy or us. And so I reached out to a friend who happened to be the TAG of Vermont, and we established a cyber operation with Vermont National Guard, first joint cyber unit. There's 22 of those in the Guard today. Most people don't want to recognize it. The only guys that do is our friend at Fletcher, who used to be SACUR, who very proudly told me and wanted me to know that they had made Estonia the NATO cyber center. And I said, well, that's reasonable to assume because Estonia's partner is the state of Maryland, and the state of Maryland has half the cyber units in the National Guard. So, but the problem with cyber is, just like he said, cyber is every commander's problem. Cyber is a major thrust. It's like fire support. You know, you don't leave the fire support to the artillery. It's an integrated capability, just like close air support. Cyber needs to be in everybody's problem. And we've gone through this. I remember having a division commander tell me when I was working for him that these hands will never touch a keyboard. And I said, you know what? The age of musketry is over. And you've got to learn, I'm glad you're getting ready to retire in about 4 years, because everybody in the military's got to understand. I mean, just look at the number of computers in your car. So look at the number of computers in our weapon systems. If you're not cyber savvy, if you're not electrically savvy, digitally savvy, you're not a professional in national defense. That's my view. I'm sure there's a lot of people who disagree
Dave,
with
he
me.
might have been ahead of his time. He was waiting for Siri.
He was an
didn't have to
infantryman.
touch the keyboard. Alexa.
He was still a bayonet.
General Cheney, any thoughts on how to coordinate DHS and FEMA and DOD and all of that?
I'm clearly going to agree with the Admiral that we don't need a COCOM for climate change. And it's a threat that impacts everybody all the way across. And so each of your departments ought to be considering it in their strategic plans, despite maybe an executive order which tells you not to. That in the past it has been, it needs to be considered as a threat to everybody. So no, I don't think we need a separate command.
Yeah.
Let me follow up on that. And I wanted to make a comment earlier. When we talk about national power, we got into this thing throughout the Obama administration about a total government. It's not total government. Everybody's got their share when you're talking about national power with the economy. Just look at the economy. You got commerce, you got treasury, you got a whole bunch of other people. You got DOD in the economy as the first element of national power, but they're not preeminent. So as you go down in intelligence, you got other people. You got treasury and intelligence. You got state and intelligence. This is the way, and so where does all this come together? It comes together in the National Security Council. So if there's any place where we need a guy to help drive the president's, whatever the president wants, and I'm not going to be judgmental on either one, the previous one or the current one, but whatever they want, somebody needs to implement that because it's a reality. I mean, climate change is a reality, and it's a national issue. Talk about threat. It's an issue. It's a civil issue today across the globe, and so that's where you bring it together. You bring it together at the NSC.
Yeah. Could be a girl, too. Sir.
Thanks for putting this together. This is fantastic. What do you think DOD should be doing? Has and DOD's steady progress moving away from that mission, surrendering that facility. Do you think that DOD should be involved still in satellite programs that monitor the environment?
I'm sure you have seen some of the news about removing funding for satellite environmental use and monitoring meteorological conditions on the Earth, which I think is a huge mistake. To use space-based monitoring is essential, in my opinion, for looking at conditions and mapping them out and seeing where climate change is having its greatest impact. DOD has a clear play in that game, so they ought to be funded and it ought to be robust.
So totally agree. These proposed cuts that are coming out, that are cutting NOAA's budget, cutting commerce overall, cutting places that you don't really make a direct connection to national security, but actually you do. We're not going to be able to get our, even with good communication and video-based satellites, we're not going to be able to get our weather to the granularity and to the timeline in terms of looking into the future from the Weather Channel. Because the big secret is the Weather Channel gets it from the National Weather Service and from NOAA and all of these other departments and agencies that need budgets, science-based budgets, to increase and really expand our ability to cover. Because to the extent, as General McGinnis pointed out, to the extent that we know more at a greater level of detail and sooner, we are going to be a more effective military, but importantly, we're going to be a more resilient country.
Ma'am in the back there. Cloud seeding and geoengineering. Anybody want to jump on that one?
Well,
Front top.
I am not the geoengineering specialist, nor am I a scientist. I think it's a science that's unproven. We don't know if you seed a cloud here, what's the impact going to be there, that type of thing. There ought to be more research into it. I'm not saying I'm opposed to it necessarily. We just don't know what the impact will be depending on what type of geoengineering you're specifically talking about here. So there's a lot of work to be done on the geoengineering side.
I go to an old ad from years ago. It's not nice to mess with Mother Nature. Because as Tom Friedman of the New York Times writes, Mother Nature always bats last, and she always bats 1,000. And so if we start fooling around with geoengineering in a random way without the kind of research that Steve just talked about, we are messing with Mother Nature, and she will mess with us. So if we don't do anything as far as mitigating our greenhouse gas production through fossil fuel use, we may get to a situation where the global community or individual large nations in the global community feel like they've got their back against the wall. The pain gets too great, and then we're going to be desperately seeking some sort of geoengineering solution that may not be the best thing. It'll create more problems than it solves. Increased research? Absolutely. And you really can't do that kind of research without really knowing a lot more than what we know today about the oceans and about the atmosphere, the kind of information and knowledge that will be gained by keeping the funding streams going for those sensors and that computing and that tremendous analysis that is necessary to point the right direction.
Yeah, I think that's right. Sir, in front, and then I'll go to the back.
My name is Bill Wyman. I'm a freelance writer. There's a political dimension to what you all have been talking about. And my question is really, how do you, what you're talking about is a problem that I think what your argument has the support of the majority of the American people. But how do you translate that into political effectiveness? Because there is a political solution, or partial solution at least, to the things you're talking about.
Well, everything's politics. Who wants to dive into politics? Welcome to Capitol
Well, I
Hill.
think there's the key first of all, political will is key to coming up with the solutions. So those political leaders have to, the first issue is they have to have an open mind, just like they do with everything else, and listen to everybody and make a decision. And I don't think that happens a lot. I know one thing we learn, and some presidents practice it and some don't. And my favorite's Harry Truman. But leaders have to listen, have to absorb information, and then make decisions. You can't make the decision and then listen to the solutions. And that's probably one of the biggest political issues that we're facing today with this issue. There's fiscal political interest, or interest being driven by fiscal realities of our political system, and other factors. And I think the biggest thing is that we're trained to look at things objectively. That's our business. We don't have a choice. We get an order, we go do it, we do it the best we can. I'm not saying the politicians don't have a lot of their factors, but one of the factors they need to take a look at in this particular case is the issue that a good leader's a good listener.
You know, Bill, I guess that's kind of why we're here today and sitting on Capitol Hill. And the sad part about climate change is when somebody like Al Gore stands up, you've already upset 50% of the population. And so one of the founding precepts of the American Security Project was, can we kind of take these political folks out of the game and focus on the national security perspective, and then try to drive that home to our Congress members so that they will understand the threat and what we can do to counter the threat and fix that, and try to, as much as you can, take the politics out of it. I can give you a lot of statistics. Over 50% of the power provided today in the Midwest is solar and wind. And I tell people that and go, oh, that's not true. It is true. November 16th, 2016, 47% of the power provided the entire state of Texas was from solar and wind. You know, and who was the former governor of Texas, who's now at the Department of Energy? It ought to be the poster child for wind. It really ought to be. And the Admiral mentioned it, there's been more jobs created by renewables in the last year than oil, gas, or nuclear combined. So it's that kind of, that's factual, it's here, it's proven, and I'll give you one of my last pet peeves. The Vice President said the war on coal is over. He's right, it is over. It's over, one, because of natural gas is so cheap these days that it's way outpacing the use of coal. Secondly, wind and solar and renewables are becoming dramatically cheaper, and your business person is looking at it and saying, I can cut this tether of fossil fuels, and I can do it cheaper with a renewable source. So, I mean, to me, the economics are just going to eventually overwhelm these heated political arguments, and that when Al Gore stands up, everybody goes, oh my God, Al Gore. You know, we need to get out of the politics side of it and then be practical about the solutions here on Capitol Hill.
Totally agree. You use, I guess, pretty practical, common sense analogies that can help sometimes. So I've got a home and I have fire insurance. Do I think there's going to be a fire? No, but there could be. So I have fire insurance. Now, if my insurance agent came and said, your yearly premium is going to go up, it's going to be $50,000 a year for fire insurance, I'd say, I don't believe in fire anymore. I just quit that. So if we figure out that, no kidding, this thing called climate change, global warming, has an ability to spur innovation and job creation, to protect civil society from the more extreme acts of Mother Nature, then you're basically saying, let's spend a little bit more on this insurance, because it basically is insurance not just against something bad happening, it certainly does that, but actually gives you a return in the way in which you become more resilient or you change your energy portfolio.
You know, that's an important point the Admiral brings up, because coal may be dead as a fossil fuel, but it shouldn't be dead, because there's a lot of things we can do with coal. We're building things out of carbon and hydrogen-carbon compounds all the time, the same way with oil. What's the source of those things? This innovation needs to include, just what he said, we need to look at things from a different perspective. We got a lot of coal in this world, and it's got a lot of capability. It's got hydrogen in it, it's got carbon in it, the same way with our other fossil fuels. So there's a perspective, I think, that's not even being addressed here. It's like everything else we have I always think that, and I've said for years, I learned a long time ago, there's more that comes out of challenges than we realize. And this is the case. I mean, even preserving the economy of those commodities, let's not call them fuels, let's call them commodities or raw materials, is something that we ought to be looking at, rather than sit back and say, I mean, yesterday I was over in the house and the place was filled with United Mine Workers. God bless them. But I really think that the opportunities that a lot of these issues, I mean, just look at the debris. How much, we're talking about Antarctica, how much of the debris in the oceans is heating the water? Is it coming all from fossil fuels, or is the plastic sitting out there sucking up the sun and transmitting that that energy into the Pacific Ocean? I don't know, but somebody ought to be looking at it. And we already know what we can do with recycling. So that's one of the ways I'd look at it too, from an entirely different light.
I think that's a good spot to end on. We're coming up on 2 o'clock. That's all the time we've got, but we're happy to stay and talk and answer a few questions offline afterwards. So thank you all for joining us, and thanks to our esteemed panel. So.